365 compañías exhibidoras y más de 6.000 asistentes acudieron a la última exposición internacional de la Asociación Nacional de Directores Funerarios NFDA, celebrada en Boston, Massachusetts, en octubre del 2009. NFDA es la asociación líder mundial del servicio funerario. Sirve a 19.000 miembros individuales que representan a más de 10.200 funerarias en los Estados Unidos e internacionalmente. Desde su sede en Brookfield, Wisconsin, y su oficina de la División de Promoción en Washington, NFDA informa, educa y promociona para ayudar a sus miembros a conseguir la calidad de servicio que ofrecen a las familias.
What are the differences between a child's death and an adult death? What extra things can we find then about pain,
Okay, well, when a child dies, it's seen as a very unnatural act. We have the notion that every child that's born is going to do all the regular things that we expect, go to school and grow up and get married and have children, and that they are going to eventually bury us, their parents. And so when a child dies, that goes against what's considered normal, and that would be called the assumptive world, how we assume things are going to go. And so when a child dies, it creates extra panic, in addition to what death does to families when it's an adult. It creates an exaggerated sense of vulnerability, and that parents realize that this is not something that they can necessarily control for, and if they have other children, it's very frightening to understand that it could happen again. It's difficult for parents and coaches and even classmates and siblings of children to understand that children can and do die, because it seems so out of the norm. And so people tend not to know how to behave, and then rather than being very supportive of families, sometimes they can actually avoid families, not because they don't care, but because they don't know what to say. They're very, very uncomfortable.
Directors help a lot in this way?
They can. Funeral directors can be enormously helpful in helping families craft a ceremony that really talks about who this child was and celebrates who this child was by having siblings speak and participate, by having classmates create artwork or memorials about their friend and classmate and have that exhibited at the funeral, or have classmates come forward and talk about their friend. Teachers who work with these students, coaches on sports teams. If this child was ill for a long time, the person who was the caregiver, the nurses maybe, even the doctors in hospital, to have them come forward and talk about their interactions with the child and how that child impacted their life. It's very, very meaningful to families.
Do you recommend psychological support for the relatives, especially the parents afterwards?
Absolutely. The death of a child is outside of what we consider normal and acceptable, and many parents are going to need some help. Not everybody who experiences the death as a child needs grief counseling or psychological help, but it should be made available to them, and funeral directors here can be helpful too in helping identify what resources in their community are available and share that information with families, so that maybe not at that time, but maybe later on when they feel ready, they may participate in that kind of support. There are support groups for parents specifically who lost children. There are support groups for children who've been murdered. There are support groups for children who committed suicide. There are all kinds of specific support groups that can be very helpful to these families, that when funeral directors make that information available, it can be very helpful. And don't forget that other members of the family are affected as well. The siblings of this child may need some help and support, psychological or emotional counseling. Grandparents the parents are not the only ones that are affected. Grandparents sometimes get marginalized, and it's devastating to lose a grandchild. You just never think that that's going to happen to you. You anticipate your grandchildren will bury you.
Yes.
And the fact that you're bearing a grandchild really goes against the normal lifespan that we consider what's to be expected. So I think anybody who needs help, classmates of children very often, can use some help. And counselors who can go into the schools and ask children questions to find out what they're thinking about, what's going on, and to begin doing some work with those children in a group can be enormously helpful, as well as with the teachers. It can be devastating for them as well.
So you recommend support?
I do. As much support as possible. As much as possible. And, support comes in a lot of different ways. Support can be very quiet and one-on-one. It can be just calling them and saying, how are you doing today? Remembering when this child's birthday and calling the parents or sending a card. Paying extra attention to this family at holiday time. Or it can be in a more public way, helping the family create maybe a memorial to this child in some way at the school or through a scholarship, maybe a park. Other parents of that child that were involved in that child's life as parents or friends of that child can show their support with families in that way if that's where the family wants to go.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
We have 3 funeral directors. We have 1 apprentice. We do about 250 funerals a year. That includes multiple cremations. As far as a cost factor goes, the cemeteries are a lot more expensive than the crematories. Mm-hmm. So when you see the cremation rate, it's skyrocketing, mainly because when you go to a cemetery, you're going to spend $2,500 for the grave, $2,000 to dig the grave, and another $500 for a liner. So before you even start talking to me, you've already spent $5,000, compared to a crematory, which is $270 and $100 for the medical examiner. So you're talking a difference of about $4,700. Mm-hmm. So from beginning to end, this is our checklist as far as funerals go. And one of the things about our checklist, we've been in business since 1930. We've never changed our checklist. Funerals don't change. Prices do, but funerals don't change. So when somebody comes in to make funeral arrangements with me, what I do is I start on the left side of my checklist and then finish up on the right side of my checklist. So by the time I finish my funeral arrangements, everybody has a pretty good idea what your funerals are going to cost. The first thing I do when a family comes in here to make arrangements is I give them a copy of my general price list. Reason being is I want to let them know exactly what my costs are, so at the end I just don't hand them a bill and say, oh my God, you charged me $12,000. It's almost like going to a restaurant and giving them a menu. They pick and choose what their things are. And what we do is we break it down a lot of times so it's broken into packages to keep it a little bit simple so they're not trying to work their way through the general price list. So a lot of the packages could be, in this particular case, is what we call a traditional funeral, which means having visiting hours, going to church, all the men on the funeral, the hearse, and a limousine. So that's one package. And then the things that would be additional would be things that are what we call cash expenditures, which have nothing to do with the funeral business or as far as profit going to me, but things you need for the funeral, which is the cemetery opening cost, newspaper costs, if you want additional limousines, flowers, holy cards, all of those things. And then the last thing I do is you pick out a casket. And the reason you pick out a casket last is because, number one, you'll know what my costs are, and then you'll know what the cash expenditures are, so you'll know exactly what your funeral costs are going to be, except for the casket. So if I did the casket first, you would know what you've already spent, and it's kind of hard to budget yourself, and it's really not too fair to the family, so that's why we wait and do the casket last. And before you leave today, we'll take you down to my casket showroom and just show you where the caskets start and where they end, where there's specialty caskets for cremation, as well as cremation urns.
We've been in business for over 100 years. Not me, but the business has been. My grandfather started, and then my father ran this one. The family has quite a few funeral homes in the area, and I've been working here since 1958. So I've seen it grow and things change in the funeral industry.
Do you have many services per year?
100 to 150 a year. We've been awfully busy the last 3 weeks, but it's been a fairly slow year so far until now.
Right.
But when someone dies, they usually die in a hospital or at home or a nursing home. And we go there and bring them to the funeral home.
You bring them here.
Bring them here and usually embalm them. And
Do you think you could show us later where you embalm the...
absolutely, yeah.
Thank you.
And families then come here and arrange their services with usually with my son Bruce, and they go over what it is they want, and they go over logistics on how to make that work, and then go over how much it's going to cost, and contracts have to be signed, and then one of us will go up on the computer and put the obituary or compose the obituary, then bring it down and show it to the family, have them approve it or change it or whatever they want, and then email them to the newspapers, usually with a photograph. And but not until we call the church, the cemetery, and make sure we can have it at that time and place. And,
What do people prefer, burying or cremation?
burying mostly, but cremation is becoming more popular. We're about 40% cremation right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Funeral Roberts.